Being an entrepreneur is a lifestyle. It's both business and personal. That's why sometimes it's hard to walk away from a business that you have spent years building. Tom and Jan Ammett of the Quad Cities know how hard it can be to sell a business and watch someone else run it. Back in the 1960s, Tom was a social worker and Jan stayed at home with their two sons. Tom's job moved them around the Midwest, and that started to take its toll on the family.
I'd moved several times working for the department, and quite frankly was seeing the effects of those moves on our oldest boy, Bill. Just kind of having trouble putting down roots and so on, because why do that? Because in a year or whatever, we'd be moving on. So actually when we came here, I promised Bill that we would stay in the Quad Cities until he graduated from high school.
Tom kept his promise to Bill, but about the same time Bill was graduating from high school, Tom was laid off. Not wanting to move until his youngest son was out of school, Tom started looking for new opportunities in the area. One thing he was considering was purchasing a franchise.
Well, he sat in his easy chair looking at franchises, and he'd throw out something. He'd say, "Oh, what about house cleaning?" And I thought to myself, I can just see him getting in a house cleaning franchise, and I get stuck to the cleaning. No way.
After running several ideas by Jan, Tom found an ad for Donut Land. Maybe a donut shop was a possibility.
I sat down in a restaurant to say, I think I've decided on donuts. That's what I want to do. And she said, that's fine, you do whatever you want to. I'm staying home and raising the kids just like I always have. So that was that.
It was decided. Tom bought into the Donut Land franchise. Jan still had goals to stay at home, but with her husband's new venture, it was only a matter of time before she was an essential part of the operation.
Part of the thing that you got from Donut Land was you could send two people for training. And it was going to be just me going, and she said, there's no point in wasting that other slot. I'll at least come in and do that. And so we went together for, I guess, about 3 months of training in Cedar Rapids. Part of the thing was cake decorating. My cake decorating skills were really bad, and she saw a need to at least come in and help with the decorating and lettering and so on and so forth. So, but then she came on board, and God bless her, and never would have made it without her.
The couple ran the Donut Land franchise in the Quad Cities until 1988. That year, Donut Land went into bankruptcy, and franchise owners were unsure of their futures.
People looked at us as being bankrupt, which we weren't. We were a functioning business, and so there were other franchisees like us who thought this is really detrimental to be attached to this company. So we asked to get out, but they wouldn't let us out unless we paid to get out. So we went to court, all of us who wanted to get out as a group, banded together, paid lawyer fees, and came to a settlement that for X amount of money we could get out of Donut Land. They gave us a start, which we couldn't have done on our own, but then we had freedom to do what we really wanted to do.
They left the Donut Land franchise and reopened as Donuts and More. By 1990, the couple owned locations in Davenport and Moline. Tom and Jan ran Donuts and More for 26 years before selling the business and retiring. They retained ownership of the land and signed a 5-year lease with the new owners. For Tom, it was a challenge watching changes being made to their old business.
You know, I said to him over and over again, or the guy who was actually going to be doing it, I said, you know, we built this up, it's got a good base as far as profit and so on. Come in, do things, we'll teach you how we did do it for 3 months. Then if you want to see things and change things, fine, go ahead, you know, try to improve or whatever. But stick with the basics for 3 months so you've got that foundation. And he came in on day 2 and was making changes right and left. There was just no point.
Over the coming years, Tom and Jan would travel, volunteer, and make the most of their retirement. But at the same time, they had to watch as their former business suffered break-ins, vandalism, and overall deterioration. As the lease for the buildings was nearing its end, it was clear that something wasn't right.
If I recall, the 28th of June, I was at a business meeting, and the secretary came in and said, Jan's on the phone. And I got on the phone, and she says, Tom, come home. And so I came home, and basically she said that the couple had stopped by the house and had said, we're not going through with it. We can't do it.
The new owners of Donuts and More had decided to let their lease expire and step away from the business. The possibility of the business they had built closing its doors was too much for Tom and Jan.
Like on the 29th, we met again with our realtor and the bank. And the banks basically said, we've had it. June 30th, we're locking the door, pulling the equipment, and going to be auctioning it off. Which meant, the employees were gone, the business was gone, and realistically, the real estate was going to depreciate because it didn't have a business there. And actually, Jan and I just never talked about it at all. I just made an offer to the bank to buy the business. And I told them, I said, this is our offer. Don't come back with a counter. There's no counter. That's what we'll give you. And they accepted. So on the 30th of June, and so July 1st, we owned the business. We didn't have a corporation set up, no bank account, nothing. And just started rushing around like mad to get things up and going.
So, July 1st, 2015, Tom and Jan re-entered the entrepreneurial world and started the long process of getting their former business back to being profitable. Helping that process are the Donuts and More employees, many of which worked for Tom and Jan when they last owned the business.
The main thing we had going for us, and that really helped us and saved us, was the employees. They basically had been running the business themselves. There was an absentee owner, absentee management, and it was just them keeping the thing going.
Even though retirement had its perks, it was difficult to watch their old business struggle. From the beginning, Donuts and More had been something that Tom and Jan have shared.
But when he was a social worker, we didn't have anything in common. He went to work every day and he couldn't talk about his social work job. You're not to discuss that with your family. So I never really knew what he was doing that much. But with this, we each had our own jobs to do, but we were still working toward the same goal in the same business, and therefore we have that we did together, and we're proud that we did that.
We've been together for 51 years. I'd be lost without her, and she's a rock, and the Lord just truly blessed me that our paths crossed and we got together. And
now in their 70s, the Ammets are looking to build their business back up and be able to hand off something they can be proud of. Tom and Jan may not have started out as entrepreneurs, but that didn't keep them from taking on the challenge twice. For the Ammets, Donuts and More is more than a business. It's personal. It's a legacy they want to leave for the Quad Cities to enjoy. Located just 5 minutes away from Waverly, Iowa, is the small town of Shell Rock. What many people don't know is that this small town has big connections to the music industry. It's all because of our next Iowa entrepreneur. After graduating early from high school, Waverly native Wade Goeke knew that he wanted to be a part of the music industry. So at the age of 18, he moved to Hollywood, California to pursue a career as a musician.
It was pretty scary, but I was so not wise that I just went off and did it. I had it in my brain I was gonna graduate school early, I was gonna go out and I was gonna start doing something. I even remember saying to my mom, I'm not coming home until I've accomplished at least something, This is how single-minded I was, And you get out there, you're from a town of 10,000 people, and then you get into one of the biggest cities in the world and you start like, oh, okay. There's some different things going on here that I hadn't anticipated, of course. And it was tough, it really was. I went to school, tech school for music, and just was studying guitar mostly, even though I sang and liked writing songs. But I was also recording. I had been recording since 8th grade, I believe, because my parents bought me a little miniature 4-track recorder. It ran on a cassette back then. And so I'd been recording my own songs since I was, in junior high. And that was always a big, big thing for me.
Although Wade wasn't studying recording, his passion on the grew.
I had my own studio always. Even since junior high, I theoretically had my own little setup. So it was always a part of the house or apartment I lived in or whatever was a studio. And I was constantly recording and trying to improve that and trying to get more gear. And after doing that for a while, I did get some jobs at a few recording studios in like the Hollywood, Los Angeles area where I lived. I worked at a couple really good places. One was called Hollywood Sound. And I actually did a Slayer record there. I was one of the assistant engineers, and got to work with Rick Rubin, who is really well known nowadays, and he was pretty well known then too, but he was the producer of it. And then later I moved to a place called Grandmaster, and I got to do some neat projects there. I worked with a fellow who had produced the Counting Crows and the Foo Fighters, and got to do some neat stuff, and learn from these people.
Wade got used to working with studio-grade equipment and wanted to have some of it in his home studio, but it was in very rare supply. Some studios even had their equipment custom-built, so there was no supply. Not being able to afford the custom-built gear, he began to purchase old equipment and repair it. Wade became a regular at the local equipment refurbishing company, purchasing parts and equipment slowly as he had the money.
I got some parts from the guy that owned it. I took back what I had made and said, hey, this is what I made with what I got from you. And he was like, oh, geez, here, have a job, So I ended up running his workshop and doing all the repairs and dealing with the customers.
Wade continued working on personal projects for his own collection. He focused on refurbishing vintage studio equipment. His parents, Dale and Judy, were willing to help.
My folks had bought me a couple really prime vintage things to use in my studio. They always said, you're not going to college, even though maybe we think you should. We've helped your brother through college, and so we're going to help you get some test gear, some stuff for your studio, so you can hopefully have a nice start. And it totally worked. I took some of those vintage things they bought me and started re-engineering them. And so I could have more of the same thing in my studio. So I looked for vintage parts, all sorts of parts to start re-engineering and rebuilding things. So in my early 20s, I was building some of the old EMI Abbey Road units that I have now. One of the pieces of equipment they bought for me was one of those. It's a real rare piece, and it came up for sale, and I was like, Mom, this is an EMI piece of equipment. Do you understand what this means? And they're like, they loved the Beatles, so obviously they had no idea what I was talking about, but they were like, okay, yeah, it was used to record the Beatles. We understand you need it for your studio. But, because they wanted to help, they did that. And so those were some of the first things I did in my early 20s, was these classic old pieces that were nearly extinct and impossible to find.
Dale and Judy wanted to help more than just financially, so Judy packed her bags and took a trip to California.
He would work all day, and then he would come back at the end of the day, and we would have supper together, and then he would go straight into his there was like a walk-in closet that was his workshop, and he would work like maybe until 2 in the morning on these things that he was designing that he hoped to sell someday. It was just a really special time that I got to spend with him.
Slowly, Wade started to sell a few pieces of his re-engineered equipment under the name Chandler Limited.
It was kind of like I was selling things out of the back of my car. You know, I had met people through working at the studios and through, you know, the other jobs I'd had. So that's where my sales were coming from initially. And then a company called Guitar Center would actually do what's called a street buy, where I would just walk up and say, guys, this is what I'm making, sell some for me. And they bought a few and they would sell them, and then they'd call me when they wanted some more.
In 1999, his side business of remanufacturing vintage studio gear had grown to the point where he was considering doing it full-time.
Dale and I are both much more cautious than Wade is, and we were both a little bit taken aback by that. I think we reminded him how much his rent was on his house in Hollywood, and he pretty much said he was going to do it.
I built a batch right away. I remember I sold 6 or 8 units to one guy out in LA, and it gave me, you know, like $10,000 to get started. And I put all that right back into more parts. And that's really what happened. I just kept doing that. In retrospect, you know, it was probably more of a dangerous time than I realized, because I up and quit my job, didn't really have any money, luckily sold some pieces and had some support from my folks, and it could have gone away at any second.
Wade had a lot of things going for him, and yet he knew that he needed to expand. But running a business and managing financials seemed like a daunting task. This is where Dale and Judy could really help. Dale was a lawyer, and Judy was a business manager.
So he would send us things in the mail, you know, that he had collected over the year for expenses and some income. And then we had to try to make heads or tails out of how to file this tax return for him. And after a couple years of doing that, we said, you know, if you're going to grow this business, you need our knowledge to help you through some of these things that you're going to need to know. And also, he was starting to sell enough gear that he probably couldn't just make it by himself. He would need to hire somebody.
I remember them saying, you know, we'd like to help you more. We think maybe if you come to Iowa, we'd be there to support you in these various ways and help you manage the business part of it too, which is not my strong point, you know. I like creating, and I like being involved with the people and doing that, but when it comes down to balancing the checkbook, I'm not the best at that. So that was kind of what the discussion was. The other thing was I had a new baby and had gotten married, and I didn't want to raise my son in California. Being from a small area and being out there for it was about 10 years at the time, I had really had enough of the traffic and feeling unsafe, and I didn't want my kid to grow up around that.
So Wade packed up his family and his audio gear and set up shop in the basement of his dad's law office in Waverly. At the time, Wade had 2 products, a microphone amplifier and an audio compressor.
Those first 2 products, we were kind of going like this. You know, it was feast or famine, and it wasn't really a feast, don't get me wrong. But it was up and down, and it was always unsure. You know, we went from one or two people to 0 there for a second with just me, because things had gotten pretty sketchy, and then they came back up again, and we kind of bounced back.
With employees to help with production, Wade was able to focus on designing. One of his dreams was to recreate some EMI equipment made famous by British musicians in its London Abbey Road studio.
when I started making those, there was really no turning back. It escalated quickly because the vintage ideal hadn't been saturated. You know, there was only a couple people doing that kind of approach at the time, and you couldn't ever buy the equipment that I was making in the past. It was all privately made to use on the Beatles, for God's sake. You know, so it was a pretty potent idea, and it just started escalating quickly once I started shipping those.
Wade's company was busy. They were selling products as fast as they could make them. It was time to expand again. So they purchased a bigger building in neighboring Shell Rock, Iowa. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Wade had inadvertently used some EMI intellectual property, and he now needed help from his dad, the lawyer.
And so they contacted me and said, well, we like what you're doing, A, but B, there's some things we think are not right or not correct, you know. So we had to go through a fair amount of discussion about, well, are we going to be mad at each other, or are we going to try and work it out and work together? And Dad, luckily, is really good at that stuff, even though he never worked on, you know, studied any of that. He has managed the entire relationship with them, and it's probably one of the most important parts of the business that is overlooked, and that even I sometimes, as a designer and a creative person, you know, I would have ruined it. And Dad, he protected us, he protected our relationship. You know, it's a two-way street, and you have to support them as well as protecting yourself. And it's a massively important part of the business.
Wade graduated high school early to pursue a life in the music industry. His passion and creativity has made his small company a big name in the recording industry. And he has made his company a true family affair, with his parents and now his brother all involved in the company.
We have commented many times that, you know, it takes a personality like Wade to go ahead and do something like this. You know, our more cautious personalities probably wouldn't have allowed us to just say, I'm going to start this business.
Having Mom and Dad and now my brother around is what let us survive as a business proper. You know, luckily I have ideas, and I really like to work on that stuff, and luckily I have them to balance me out. You know, I couldn't have done it on my own, that's for sure. Yeah.